The sun was beginning to set over Sacramento, casting golden streaks across the sky as Eric Porter made his way home from a long day at work. His sedan hummed quietly, the soft whir of the engine almost soothing as he adjusted the air conditioning, eager to shake off the day's stress. The radio played softly in the background, a gentle antidote to the city's chaos. As Eric approached an intersection, a yellow light blinked on, and he slowed down just in time for it to turn red. Then came the flash of blue and red behind him, followed by the sharp sound of a siren. Eric glanced in his rearview mirror, his brow furrowing slightly as he pulled over to the side of the road, rolling down his window. A police cruiser parked behind him, and out stepped Officer Bradley Larson, a man in his mid-30s with a buzz cut, his badge gleaming with authority. Larson swaggered toward the car, adjusting his belt as though accustomed to being in control. "License and registration," he said curtly. Eric complied without a word, reaching into his glove compartment for his documents. As he handed over his driver's license and registration, he could feel Larson's eyes scanning him, looking for something to dig into. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Larson asked, leaning in closer. "I'm not entirely sure," Eric answered, his voice calm but firm. "You didn't come to a complete stop at the light," Larson said, though there was a brief hesitation in his tone. Eric frowned. "I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand." Larson didn't respond immediately. His eyes lingered on Eric, studying him. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore. It wasn't even about the traffic violation. Larson's posture subtly shifted, as though he'd already decided this was going somewhere else. "You're not from around here, are you?" Larson asked. Eric hesitated just long enough for the officer to notice. "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But Larson wasn't really listening. His questions became sharper, just enough to imply he was digging for something more than a traffic violation. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" Larson asked, leaning in a little too close. "Just going home," Eric replied evenly, but there was an undeniable tension in the air now. Larson wasn't just looking at Eric the way most officers would. No, he saw something else, a reason to be suspicious, and it was making Eric's skin crawl. Eric, however, didn't flinch. He knew this game well. Larson took a step back, folding Eric's documents with a slow, deliberate motion before tucking them into his chest pocket. He straightened up, his expression shifting to something smug, as if he'd already figured Eric out. "Step out of the car," Larson ordered. Eric's grip tightened on the steering wheel for a second, but his face showed no sign of reaction. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked, his voice even. Larson's lips twitched. "I asked you to step out. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The unspoken threat was clear, but Eric's response was slow and steady. He exhaled deeply, then opened the door and stepped out. Larson's eyes flicked over him, sizing him up. Eric stood slightly taller than the officer, his broad shoulders commanding attention, but his demeanor was anything but threatening. His tailored suit suggested professionalism. His polished shoes said he was meticulous. Yet Larson's expression didn't change. He didn't care about any of that. "Hands where I can see them," Larson ordered, gesturing to the front of the car. Eric complied. His movements were controlled, deliberate. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" he asked, his gaze fixed on Larson. Larson smirked. "Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. Can't be too careful." Eric turned his head slightly. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or does this have more to do with something else?" The question hit its mark, and for a moment Larson's composure cracked. He straightened up, his hand drifting toward his belt. It was more reflex than necessity. "Watch your tone," Larson snapped, though his voice was thinner than before. Eric didn't back down. "I'm simply asking a question." Larson leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing. "You seem awfully familiar with how this works. Got something to hide?" Eric's calm didn't falter. No, officer, I just believe in being clear about the reasons for an interaction like this. Transparency. Larson scoffed, but didn't reply. The tension between them was palpable, but it didn't seem to unsettle Eric in the least. You seem pretty confident, Larson muttered, mostly to himself. Eric didn't rise to the bait. Confidence isn't the issue here. Respect is. For a split second, Larson froze. He didn't know how to respond to that. The shift in power was starting to dawn on him, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. Turn around and place your hands on the hood, Larson barked. I need to check for weapons. Eric raised an eyebrow. Weapons? Larson's jaw tightened. I'm not going to ask you again. Eric's hesitation lasted only a moment. Then, without another word, he turned and placed his palms flat against the hood of his car. The search was quick, rougher than necessary. Larson's hands lingered a little longer than they should have, testing for a reaction. But Eric didn't flinch, didn't stiffen. He stood still, unfazed. You're clean, Larson muttered, stepping back, the words grating in his mouth. Eric turned to face him. Of course I am. Now, officer, if you're done— I'm not done, Larson interrupted, his voice rising. You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why? Eric folded his arms, still relaxed. I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement. Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years. Larson's eyes narrowed. So, you a lawyer or something? Eric smiled faintly. Or something. Larson stepped forward, invading Eric's space. You think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this? Eric met his gaze, unwavering. I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness, and so far I'm not seeing much of it here. Larson's lips parted, but no words came. The challenge hung in the air, thick and heavy, and Larson took the bait. Fairness? You think fairness is what this is about? Larson stopped abruptly, the words hanging there, unfinished. Eric's expression didn't change, but the air between them shifted. People like me, he repeated softly. Larson bristled, stepping back. You know what I mean, he muttered, but the conviction in his tone had evaporated. I think I do, Eric said quietly. I think we both know this stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago. Larson opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The uncertainty in his eyes was unmistakable. The power balance had shifted, and he wasn't sure how to regain control. Eric's voice broke the silence, steady and sure. Officer, I think it's time you know who I am. Larson's brows furrowed, but he wasn't prepared for what came next. Eric pulled out a leather wallet and flashed his badge, the gleaming metal catching Larson's eye. Eric Porter, he said, his tone casual, like introducing himself to a neighbor. Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division. Larson froze, his eyes darting between the badge and Eric's face. Internal Affairs? Larson's voice cracked slightly. Yes, Eric replied. I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that the people wearing this badge uphold the integrity it's meant to represent. Larson took a small step back. His confident exterior was crumbling. Eric stepped forward, closing the gap. Do you know what's most troubling about this interaction, Officer Larson? Larson didn't answer. It's not the profiling. It's not the baseless escalation. It's that you've done all of this without realizing who you were talking to. Eric paused, his gaze sharp. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold. And why? Larson opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Eric finished for him. Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect. Eric stepped back, his voice hardening. And that's a problem for you, Officer Larson, but it's a bigger problem for everyone you encounter in this uniform. Larson's shoulders sagged, the full weight of Eric's words settling in. Eric's voice cut through the silence, unwavering. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next." Larson hesitated, clearly torn. After a long beat, he reached into his chest pocket, pulled out Eric's license and registration, and handed them over, his hands trembling. Eric took them without a word, his gaze never leaving Larson's face. He slid into his car, the engine humming to life. Before pulling away, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. "Remember this, Officer Larson," he said, his voice steady. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." The drive home was quiet, but Eric's mind was anything but. The encounter wasn't unique, it was just one more example of a systemic issue that needed addressing. But this time, things would be different. The next morning, Eric sat in his office at Internal Affairs, focused on a file. Officer Bradley Larson. His record wasn't spotless. Minor complaints of misconduct, excessive stops, and vague misunderstandings. But this time, things would be different. Eric wasn't here to put a bandage on a bullet wound. Later, Eric met with Chief Daniels, laying out his plan for a department-wide review, focusing on training, accountability, and culture. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about creating change, a shift in how the department operated, how officers were trained, and how they treated the public. The weeks that followed were filled with meetings, interviews, and reports. Eric worked tirelessly, bringing together officers and community members to confront the issues head-on. The Larson incident became a catalyst, a wake-up call for the department. Months later, Eric stood at a podium addressing a room full of officers, city officials, and residents. His voice rang out, clear and strong. Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys. It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect. The applause was deafening. But for Eric, this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The change was coming, and this time, Eric Porter would make sure it stayed.